This is the Cientifico Latino, a part of our graduate school mentorship initiative. And today we're going to be talking about demystifying admissions into PhD programs in the biomedical sciences. And to start off, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Denisha, and I'm one of your webinar coordinators. And I'm a fourth year graduate student in the neuroscience department at the University of Rochester. And then I'll let Daisy introduce herself as well.
Yeah. And hi guys, my name is Daisy. I am a fifth year student, PhD student in Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry at Yale. And I've been serving as a GSMI webinar director for the past 3 years or so, but I've been part of a team for the last 4 years. Yeah. Thank you guys all for coming. Okay.
Thank you, Daisy. Okay, so first I'd like to thank our panelists who you're going to hear from in just a second. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to give advice and share your wisdom. And I'll have you guys just introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Dr. Christina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tina Kim. I started as an assistant professor at UC Davis about 2 years ago. And I'm in both the neuroscience graduate group and the biomedical engineering graduate group here. And so hopefully excited to share some insight on those two different processes.
Thank you. Dr. Antentor?
Hi, I'm Dr. Antentor O Hinton. I'm on panel at the NIH, so it may be a little background noise, so I apologize for that. But I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Molecular Physiology and Biophysics at Vanderbilt and a member of the Diabetes Center. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And thank you so very much.
Dr. Anthony?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tony Koleske. I'm a professor of molecular biophysics and biochemistry at Yale. I have the great privilege, actually, of having Daisy Duan as a colleague to work with every day. I ran admissions for our graduate program for about a decade, and then I actually led our combined PhD programs at Yale in the Biological and Biomedical Sciences for 6 years. So it's really terrific to have an opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. Okay, so to start off this conversation that we're going to have, what are the steps in the application review process? So we want to know at your respective institutions, what is the review process like? Anyone can feel free to unmute and go first.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go ahead and start a bit. So for example, at UC Davis, the general process is that there are a group of faculty that are on the specific admissions committee, and they are the ones who first will get all the applications. We usually divide up into groups of something like 3 faculty will all review the same applicant, so that, it's not just, you don't get unlucky for some reason, just one person didn't really mesh with your application. There are like 2 or 3 other chances for people to kind of evaluate your entire application. And so we're essentially all doing like a very quick kind of rating system at first, just to kind of get an evaluation of all the applications. So this is going to come up on some of the next questions, but we're definitely not just ranking students based on test scores, based on GPAs, nothing like that. We have a sort of set guidelines of characteristics or quality that we look at. And then we give every applicant a ranking on that, their average across all of the applicants. And then as a larger group, everyone gets together and then sort of discusses every person that they had evaluated. And this is kind of a chance for if someone really had, some connection to some applicant who wasn't above some certain threshold, then they can sit and advocate for that applicant. Or if there's a faculty member who really wanted to, you know, perhaps recruit one of the students. That's another chance as well. After that point, you know, they decide to invite a number of candidates for an interview. So this is a stage where I think it depends on which graduate group you're in. Even within UC Davis, the different graduate groups have different processes, but sometimes they'll do like a pre-interview over Zoom and then just talk to some of the applicants that way, and then invite a subset of those to come visit the campus. And at that point, it's kind of more like a recruitment. You know, we know we're really excited about you. It seems like you'd be a really good fit. And now trying to also give the students a chance to talk to faculty that they're interested in, to see if they could really envision themselves doing a PhD at that university. So that's the general workflow of things at Davis.
Thank you. Dr. Koleske?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So each of our admissions tracks runs a little bit differently, but I think they largely parallel what Tina outlined. Usually, every application is read by at least 3 people, and there's some scoring matrix. I think we can get into that a little bit as we go through. And similarly, I think there's the room, especially I think to look for when there's discord, maybe in scores, there's an opportunity to have a more in-depth focus on an individual application. And then initially, and again, it depends a little bit on the program, but most of the programs then will have interviews via Zoom, and with 1 or more committee members, and then there'll be an invitation on campus for one-on-one meetings with students, meetings with other stakeholders, and I think an opportunity to really introduce them to New Haven, and you know what apartments look like, you know what the layout of the town looks like. So we really try to give people an idea of what the experience is like.
Right, thank you. Dr. Hinton, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on during the understanding of the application review process is also to think about things in a holistic manner, especially for graduate school, because now things have kind of changed with the opening of not having GRE scores. Some schools still require it. However, one of the big things to keep in mind is that how can you make yourself more holistic? One thing is doing research and always putting that first. That's always been the case, but it's more critical now than ever. Being selective about the summer programs, using the word on the street, if you will, of individuals that have already been in summer programs, that certain PIs were really phenomenal. So kind of creating a list among your friends about where that was at. And that would be really important, because then it allows for you to be able to go to the same labs, potentially get on papers, potentially be able to work in a way that's going to be securing you a strong letter of recommendation. And also the letters can save an application. So maintaining your friendships is great, but really think of them as like you're nurturing the personal relationship. So don't think of your PI as a friend. Think of it as you're maintaining that long-term relationship in order to kind of get the strongest letter possible. And checking in small doses to make sure that they can do this by doing certain applications at the beginning before the graduate application or the medical school application, like small things so you can see what they're testing as far as what they consider a strong letter for you, because everyone's strong letter is different. And remember that sometimes providing template points in addition to key highlighted things that you want to overall include in your letter is key, because there's sometimes gender differences within letters. There's also bias around ethnicity and race sometimes that are just implicit biases that we're not sometimes aware of. And so actually having those key points and doing above and beyond by showing this is my paper, this is this, when you're actually in that process before you get to the review will enhance your application. Now, specifically on the review point, one thing to think about is the interview. everyone else has already kind of touched on what happens, but the interview is practicing. I will send you a list of questions that usually happens for grad school that I published recently. They're usually in different areas. So they care about your methodology, like your research that you've done. They care about personal conflict, how you address that in troubleshooting. These are two of many areas. I don't want to spend the whole time, but these are things that you should think about and practice your questions and responses early on. So that's something that I just wanted to add that's a little bit different than everyone else.
Thank you so much. That's actually a really great segue into our next question. It was a few years ago since I was a grad student, or like before grad school, trying to apply and figure out, navigate applications and whatnot. And I think it's interesting that you made the point about focusing on applications being holistic and not just one thing. But another important thing that you touched on was about bias. And we know that bias is often unavoidable. So from your perspectives, what are some things that the selection committee does to remove potential biases? For example, we mentioned that some schools will no longer require GRE scores. They'll say, don't even put it on the application. For example, some schools don't look at GPA or university names, but what, in your experiences, what are some things that are done to remove biases?
One obvious thing is we don't, and I think it may be illegal now to include age or race, or racial identification. So that's kind of an obvious one. We haven't required the GRE, gosh, for many years now, maybe 5 or more years. It's been quite a while. So that's that, and I don't think it's an advantage at all to include it. What I would say is the way that we view, and I think this follows a lot on Dr. Hinton's advice. We have really two main criteria that we're trying to assess as part of that holistic review. One is really what is the candidate's record of scholarship and dedication to scholarship. So that would entail what the coursework is that you took, and what were the opportunities there. We'll get into kind of motivation for research, but I think there's an intersection there in the coursework in motivation for research, because there are courses certainly that can help either teach you research skills that might be electives, or can enable you to have an opportunity to study or learn or pursue research in an independent project. So for example, a senior thesis, or even a seminar course where you do an independent project. So we'll get to probably personal statements, and those would be things that I would highlight as well. I think on the motivation front, all excellent advice. I think the points that Dr. Hinton made, we recognize, I think, straight out that that not everybody has the same sorts of opportunities, and I think motivation for research and what you've done may not be completely synonymous depending on what your experience is. But I think you can show motivation again in a number of ways. Certainly, if you've been in an immersive research experience, such as some of the summer programs that Dr. Hinton highlighted, I think what we're looking for there is really evidence that PhD is a full-time training to be a professional scientist, and that's not the same thing as maybe taking a lab class or majoring in something. And so I think anything that you can do that provides evidence that you've done something out of your way to get an immersive experience in research, so that you really know what it entails and what it's like. And we'll talk more about that, I think, as well, when we talk about letter writers and letters of recommendation. I think the fear is we don't want to. It's not a good idea to recruit anybody into graduate school if they don't really know what they're getting into, and so that's probably the greatest concern there. in terms of grades, we certainly, different programs treat them differently. What I would say though is, in terms of the track that I ran, the coursework here was, for the track I ran, was very quantitative, and very kind of biophysical. And so I think if you consistently were struggling in math courses, and physical chemistry and things like that, it would probably we'd be a little bit concerned about whether or not this would be the best program for you, because in the end you do have to pass the classes in addition to the lab work. So I think so I think that would be calibrated a little bit with the type of program that you're trying to approach. Now, the other thing that we do know is that different school, and A is a different A at every other school, right? So I think we're also pretty aware of that, and we did have kind of a running informal tabulation, at least of most of the schools. We had a pretty broad list of kind of what grade inflation, how that factored into the systems. So I'll stop there.
Can I
Thank
jump?
you. Sure, go ahead. Mhm.
Okay. So I do want to touch on the difference in grades and things like that. So first thing, just to give you kind of like background, I went to Winston-Salem State, which is a HBCU. So I'm speaking from experience. So one thing to keep in mind is that there are differences in the context of if you're at a HBCU or HSI or tribal college, maybe your grades are different than ones that are at, like, let's say Harvard or Vanderbilt. That is true in some sense, but not always the case. So I don't want you to be discouraged by that. That is a fact that is usually weighted. Like, there may not be as often as many resources to be able to have those experiences. But one thing that you can say is, especially if you have individuals that are at institutions across the street, let's say like in my case, Wake Forest or Duke, there was ERACTA programs at the time where they would come and teach some of the course. So you can actually implement that in your graduate statement, your personal statement, to say that, like, although I'm at a HBCU, I know that my A is of the same caliber because we actually had these individuals come in and teach. So this is a little like gem that you can add. You don't have to add it all the time, but it's just something to put in there. And another thing is you can do a post-bac program. Don't feel discouraged. Let's say like graduate school is for you, but they say no this time. Do not be discouraged. A post-bac program can eliminate any difference in what is perceived rigor differences, because most of the time I really want to tell you that it's perceived differences sometimes, because there's just a standard at which has been recapitulated every year over and over again, and people kind of stick to that. But the idea is that, remember, you are a rule breaker in the context that you can achieve regardless of whatever someone else says. It is the limitation that you put on yourself. So that's why you're a rule breaker, because you can up your level each time. So that's just to keep that in mind. The other thing is sometimes there are cases where you can do BS to PhD or BS to post-bac then PhD. And there's other times where you may need to strengthen your GPA if it's lower than 3.0, but doesn't mean that you're not entitled to going to graduate school. So think of an online master's in case you need to work during the daytime and you have life. So for example, University of Florida provides different master's degrees as an example. You could do that master's and then you can go from there into a PhD program. So it's just something to keep in mind. So I just don't want you to be discouraged by a lower GPA, or if you're from, let's say, Winston-Salem State, which is not even ranked in the top 20 of the HBCUs. Back in the day, it was 15 or 12. But that's just to give you an example that you can come from a lower status school, if you will, and you can achieve excellence. Because I'm at Vanderbilt, the #5 program for my medical research. So it's just how you have the mentors to help you along the way, so that the selection committee can have all the necessary high-level viewpoints to enhance your application and bring it towards the table when they're having the final review.
Thank you for that. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think would be beneficial to ask live, especially given the response from Dr. Hinton just now. And so can you guys comment on the question, would taking the GRE help if the student has a weaker undergraduate GPA? And also, how is a master's GPA evaluated in an application, especially if it's stronger than an undergraduate GPA? So this also ties into, bias against grades as well as test scores.
Yeah, so I think in my opinion, especially in terms of like evaluating a master's GPA versus undergraduate GPA, it's really just kind of how you spin it. So let's say like your overall undergrad GPA isn't great, but then you went and did a master's in something that was like a little bit more focused and what you eventually want to do in your PhD. And that's an excellent opportunity to be like, hey, look, whatever happened in undergrad happened, but now I'm focusing in on this subject matter that I really want to pursue for the rest of my PhD. And, and here's what I've been able to show for it, like grades improved, you have your research experience. And I think that's just an opportunity for you to kind of get ahead of any potential bias that might appear. The same thing with the GRE. I mean, I don't know, that one's kind of interesting because in my opinion, GREs, they're already so broad. And so I would say, if you felt like you were going to be able to, take the GRE, do really well on a certain either specific subject GRE test or, on the math related ones, then of course that's another opportunity for you to be like, when I focused in on this, then my, my grades, my whatever's academic achievement, one example of an academic achievement. But really, I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of ways for you to demonstrate academic achievement beyond just a single GPA, whether that's like a particular class that you like really nailed and, like that then spurred your desire to want to go into, research and things like that. Just kind of crafting a narrative can help a lot of times, I think, go get around that issue as well.
Thank you. And just one more side question that ties into this theme of bias. Does admission favor students coming straight from undergrad in comparison to students who've taken gap years and also acquired non-academic research experiences?
In my experience, absolutely not. That, a lot of the students that we ultimately accept have, spent time, significant amount of time in some cases between their undergrad and deciding to go to graduate school. It is true that many of them may have been working as a research technician in a lab or perhaps, doing some other type of, academia related type thing, not necessarily science. They could, sometimes we get Fulbright scholars or something, or people who've been doing post-bac programs. So it's absolutely not considered a negative, I think, if you are not coming straight from undergraduate.
I wanted to just clarify a couple of things when you're talking about that in the context of the question. I think it's great points that you made. One thing I also wanted to bring up is that if you're in medical school, like doing MD, PhD, when you're younger, sometimes that can count against you because they don't think that you may be mature enough to be in clinic. So if you're like 18, 19, super genius type of level, and you finish your PhD, it may be better for you to go out and do more clinical hours to be able to actually push yourself into the top category for MD, PhD. That's just a little small tip. If you feel that you've got enough clinical hours and then the research experience, still go for it. But be aware that sometimes that can happen. There's discussion sometimes on MSTP programs around that. So just putting that out there. And then my take on the undergrad and graduate, it just depends. Depends on the institution you're applying to, because sometimes they average both GPAs together. They look at both and say, oh, they've improved. Or it could be some other combination of what they may value, which is certain grades if you're applying to certain part of a PhD program. So biochemistry, they may weigh your biochemistry and your master's and your undergrad more important than everything else. So just kind of be aware of what type of PhD program you're applying to.
Yeah, and maybe I can also clarify if there are if you perceive that there are weaknesses in your transcript, I think the one way to mitigate that is to address it. And there are a couple of ways that you can address it. You can address it yourself in your statement. My first year, my sophomore year, I had a terrible GPA, and that was, I had a rough year personally. And, but I think that would explain it if that was a deviation. I think the other thing that you can do, and again, it comes from this view of yourself as a holistic applicant. I frankly don't care what your GPA is if your letters of recommendation say that people have seen you in a research environment and in a group setting or in any relevant context, and you are spectacular. Okay, then it doesn't really matter. Some people just aren't great test takers. So I think, let's put it this way. I many years ago, when I started in this business, this was like 25 years ago, the graduate school used to ask us to rank our applicants, okay, when we were offering them admissions at the Yale graduate school. And I had no objective way of doing this, right? And so what would you have done it on 20 years ago? You probably would have picked GRE scores and grades. Okay, so I had for many years what our rank list. I objected to this, but they'd make us do it or they wouldn't issue the letters for admission. So I could go back and I could look at those rank lists, 10 years out, and there was absolutely no correlation between any of that and how well the people did in our program with respect to making important new discoveries, publishing their work, and getting on to viable and great careers after this. Okay, so I know that. I think most of the people leading our admissions know that, and so. But what I would say is, if you feel that you have something that you want to address, you have opportunities in the application to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Koleske. I think that's interesting because it leads perfectly into our next question, which you kind of just touched on, where you're talking about one thing that's important to consider is, if there is something that you feel is a weakness, potentially talking about it ahead of time. So what stands out to you the most when you're reading a personal statement or a statement of purpose? And if is there something that an applicant should emphasize in both statements? So for example, if someone feels like they have a lower GPA, do you think maybe they should focus more on their research experience that may be relevant, or maybe they should include something talking about their grades in terms of maybe justifying their application in these essays? Or what would your advice be on that?
I think my personal advice would be, if you're going to address it and get through it and get over. I wouldn't spend a whole paragraph on what my life was like my sophomore year in college and what a disaster and perseverate. I think you can address it, get through it, and get over it. What I would say, get through it and move on, to the more positive things. I think what I look for in anything with respect to personal statement or motivation are to try to be as specific as possible for what your motivations and interests are, and to give examples if you possibly can. It doesn't do you any good to say I'm broadly interested in this theme, I think, because you wouldn't be applying to that program if that's what the program is. And I think you can use the examples in really positive ways to highlight, some key element of your experience that touches on your motivation. Okay, again, you're trying to convince this committee, this group of readers, that you're highly motivated for this program. And so I think that including specific details on your own experience and really how that's gotten you to where you are and why you're focusing on this program. And I think it's also important to maybe try to do a little bit of reading on potential mentors or research interests and refer specifically to them, how your interests maybe align with specific faculty, specific people. In fact, I know our application asks whether you've been in contact with anybody at the university. We can talk about that a little bit later. But I do think that's a really a good idea. I also think it's great to say, but look, that's what I'm interested in now. But I know that I'm going to come there and I'm going to take all this great coursework and I'm going to learn and I'm going to interact with your community. And I think it's pretty likely that other interests will emerge. And so I am open-minded and eager to learn what other offerings are there. And I think that, I love people, if you want to do yourself one good, read on positive growth mindset right now, like tonight, read on it and try to cultivate that in yourself, because I think that's the very best you can offer as a scientist in training. Look, I really am excited, and this is what I'm willing to learn and what I want to gain from the experience.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Kim.
Oh yeah, I really resonate with a lot of what Dr. Koleske was talking about. For me, when I guess, well, two things. So in terms of personal statements, I absolutely agree. It's a great idea to address something that you perceive or worry that might be a deficiency or a weakness, just to address it quickly, but not to perseverate, and then to transition into sort of the contrast. It's kind of like, this is what happened, and then I turned it around or changed something, and then here is the improvement. So I think for me, like when we read these statements and there's evidence of, resourcefulness or like distance traveled, of kind of like the path you took in order to get where you are now, that's something that really stands out in applications. And another thing that kind of, I think most, I guess, professors reading these will tend to think about is your ability to sort of think independently, and it's fine if you haven't had tons of independent lab experience yet, but just as this idea of that, you understand that graduate school is essentially just learning how to be an independent thinker, an independent problem solver, and wanting to hone those skills and develop those skills. And I think sort of showing an awareness of that is something that's really a big strength in these applications. One comment I would have about when you do like a research statement, a summary of your previous research, is that sometimes, and maybe this depends on who's reading it or not, but sometimes, there will be applications where maybe that person has had the opportunity to sort of participate in many different research settings, but only very, very short amount of times. And I would suggest, perhaps, rather than listing all of them and just kind of a laundry list, being like, oh, hey, and then I did this, this, and this, and this, maybe to try and focus on one or two and describe a little bit, flesh out a little bit more, like what the big picture question was and what you were doing to try and address that and what your role was in it. And I think that can carry a lot more weight than just kind of stating that you had helped out in a bunch of different projects, but kind of showing, at least for one or two, that you had a deeper understanding of sort of the thought process and of what you were trying to solve and how you did it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant by being specific about what your role was. Absolutely.
So I wanted to comment too. So one thing is that just in case your personal statement, they may also give you a research statement. So if they give you the research statement, spend your whole time focusing on the research, but also emphasize what you specifically did during the project, what you learned, and then how you built on that set of skills for your next research internship. That little section will be important than just writing, I knocked out these set of proteins in this particular cell line and I did this and it's related to that. So it shows a depth of thinking. You also should talk about, if it's just a research statement, some of the things that you had trouble with and how you overcame them, because it shows that you have troubleshooting skills, Now, in the personal statement, if it's separate, one of the things that I would suggest is highlighting your weaknesses and talking about them as lesser strengths. It's all in how you sell yourself and you brand yourself and what you did to enhance that during your process of finishing your degree. If they're combined, I would say spend about maybe 45, 65%, where it's 45% on accolades, your posters that you've presented, and how you integrated that research into your degree and maybe your shortcomings. And then the other 65% on your research and emphasizing those key points that I referred to, but in a more narrow focused way so that you can be able to get everything into that page or a page and a half that's required for the page limit. One thing to also think about is if you're applying to those particular schools of interest, try to contact individuals that are already there and get samples of their personal statements per school so that you can see what actually more recently the applicant pool looked like and then what they accepted. So just the thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hinton. Okay. With that being said, what advice do you guys have in discussing the impacts of the pandemic on lack of research experiences during early career stage? And this is in particular for those who probably want to talk about this in their personal statement. Do you guys have any advice on how to talk about the pandemic and maybe that being a hindrance for a lot of students in acquiring research experiences? And also, can you guys also briefly touch on how the admissions committee is viewing this sort of gap where the world shut down for a lot of us?
So I'll go. There were a lot of programs that were just research-based in the context of virtual experiences. So one thing to think about is acquiring some of those virtual experiences. Let's say that you did highlight those because those are going to be those metadata analysis where you have lots of data that you're analyzing, or you may be doing quantification something or learning like UMAP analysis. So all those particular things are important, and you can talk about the computational awareness. And I would, coin that in the context that like we're moving towards AI. So even though there was the pandemic, I was able to acquire a lot of computational based skills. And this is how I'm applying that in my personal statement and what I want to do in the future. Because in, let's say cell biology, there's going to be times where you have to do single cell versus RNA-seq, and I need to know the differences. So that's how you market it during the pandemic, if that is what happened to you. If it's not the case and that didn't happen to you, one thing that you can talk about is that the pandemic, impeded you from being able to do research. However, the 2 research programs that I had previously helped me to think about what I could do on my own. So one thing that I did was started to do lit reviews. So you actually started to enhance your knowledge around a certain area. And then you did this on your own. And you can give examples of some pondering questions that were very influential in your research and how you would like to apply that to faculty that are at that institution. So that's one way that you could word that. Another way is to say that you did other leadership opportunities, you had support groups. So you can talk about your leadership in certain ways instead of just focusing on solely the research, because you have to be a leader also in the laboratory. And so those are skill sets that you can enhance. So you can say these are other things that you did during this time period to be able to enhance yourself and to make sure that you're prepared.
Dr. Koleske, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think that's about the perfect answer.
Yeah. Okay.
I even know many labs that in addition to programs, labs were running for undergraduates, undergraduate journal clubs or data analysis pipelines. So I think that Dr. Hinton gave a great answer. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I saw this question come up in the chat. And given the current state of affairs, we have some potential applicants that are wondering, does the affirmative action ban impact the PhD admissions requirements, for example, diversity statements, and also the review process. And if you guys can also touch on what efforts your respective institutions are making in order to ensure equity and inclusivity are met across applications.
So the only thing, to my knowledge, that's changing is that we can't include race. It's not on the application. So I don't think that anything significant is going to change in that light. Aside from that, in terms of efforts, what I would say is we probably what we do will not change there either. I think most of our efforts have been focused on the front end, either on getting the word out and recruiting, and trying to reach out to scientists who we might not intersect with, and going to meetings, going to ABRCAMs, going to SACNAS, going to we have a pretty extensive list of either social media contacts, and so I think our goals are still I mean, the empirical evidence is there that the more diverse your research team, the greater the productivity and the higher the impact of the work. And so that's what's driving, I think, our efforts. And so nothing's changing. If anything, we're doubling down.
Yeah, so I know at UC Davis, I think it's been this thing where there's this New York Times article about the UC Davis Medical School and how they have sort of created a tool. I think they call it the socioeconomic disadvantage scale or something, that they've been using for a number of years, especially since California, had already voted, back in the 90s to ban affirmative action in their admissions process. But there are ways that I think schools that care about it, they're just going to emphasize it anyways. And there are other ways to determine things like, I think this UC Davis scale takes into account things like life circumstances, family income, parental education, and they just incorporate all of these aspects into the other parts of the admissions committee. And I think it's, as long as the values are core to what an institution and what a graduate group cares about, like they still value and prioritize these aspects in recruiting students from underrepresented backgrounds in the sciences. And so my opinion, thank you for sending that that link in the chat. So my opinion is that it's really unfortunate in a lot of cases, but I think at the graduate level, I think the people are doing the work to make sure that that diversity is still well represented in the students that we recruit.
Oh, I wanted to touch on this. So a couple of things. Just think about eliminating the diversity statement for right now in the context of like it being a future goal that would be something that could help break down barriers. Berkeley, of course, has a scale that they use. And so for right now, it's kind of coming under fire. So don't think about having to use a diversity statement to show that you're unique. There are still certain programs that exist that you can put into your statement that demonstrates your need of demonstrating who you are as an individual. So there's ways to code certain things without having to say diversity, equity, or inclusion. So you could use words such as mentorship, mentoring, leadership, or enrichment programs that have allowed you to be able to have more of a sense of belonging in your current environment. So these words, I would change how you say them. And I do strongly agree with the UC Davis system because this is probably the best system in the entire country for picking up individuals from diverse backgrounds, especially for the medical school program. And so one thing to think about is that how can you think about aligning yourself with programs that are safe to go to. Obviously, yes, Vanderbilt's a great school, but there's also concerns about things in the state. The same thing with Texas and Florida. So you have to pick things based upon fit. So don't worry so much about the affirmative action ban. Find your institution based upon fit. So if it does happen to be in Florida, then you have to ask yourself, what are the surrounding things that are going to help me to maintain? And so let's say there could be HSI institutions that are around that you can support yourself with, or HBCUs that you could be able to get the needing that you need. And the reason I say it like that is because a lot of times we don't really get what we need out of our home institution. Sometimes it's next door. So in my case, Fisk and Meharry are really the ones that support me for being like one of the very few Black faculty in basic sciences. And so you have to find your environment and your network around other ways. So don't limit yourself and be worried about what's happening with the affirmative action ban. You can't control politics, but you can control your environment and who you decide to hang around. Now, in the context of PhD programs, there has been a shift in how certain groups are applying more than others based upon the institution and certain changes in the laws. So be aware of that. Places that have IMSD programs for at least the next 4 to 5 years, depending on how long the grant stays intact, are safe. You can find out information on Googling like NIGMS, IMSD, NIGMS, MARC, or RISE. So then you can see that there are some safe havens at certain institutions, but be aware that it's harder now for HBCUs and HSIs to acquire MARC program grants for the G part because they have to have R1s coming in to be affiliated with those type of programs now. So just my thoughts.
Right, right. Thank you for that. So I know earlier in the conversation, we did talk a lot about the personal statement and how important that is. And so another important part that we know about the application process are recommendation letters. So when it comes to recommendation letters, how heavily is that weighed against other factors? And additionally, what can an applicant do if their advisor submits a mediocre recommendation letter?
Well, recommendations are very, very important. Okay, and I think again, ideally they would come from people that have observed you in a situation where you've had a dedicated focus and been able to accomplish something. And the reason I stated it that way rather than it being just in the lab is because I think it could come from even someone. I've seen very powerful letters written by members of the community who've actually seen people excel in an environment, in a community setting, in a volunteer situation. But the best way to get ahead of the second point, the mediocre thing, is to try to get ahead of it. So, I would prefer not to write a letter for somebody unless I knew them well enough that I could cite specific examples where I thought they had demonstrated some sort of material and intellectual contribution, to a problem, or done something very specific, or persisted through some difficulty. You need that kind of direct anecdote, I think, to validate the letter. Letters that just say so-and-so was in my class and they did okay, and they raised their hand 5 times, that doesn't help you. The letter needs to sort of, it helps you a lot more if it comes from someone who has worked enough more closely with you, because what that does then is, that also enables the committee to get on the phone with that person if there's any doubt, to check that out. And I used to do that routinely if it was a case that we were a little bit less certain about. So I think they're really important. I wouldn't just you know, if you have a big class and you never spoke to the professor and you never contributed and they didn't really get to know you in any sort of context, I would be very wary of asking that person. And it might even be better in those circumstances to ask somebody, you know, maybe there's a postdoc in the lab, or a senior scientist in a lab, or somebody who is you know, a coordinator for something that you were doing, that can state very specifically, you know, what you did, and comment on your character, and you know, how your perseverance, your attitude, your reliability, you know, these sorts of things matter just as they do in any other, dare I say it, employment situation, which you know, people care about you and your character.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Koleske. Dr. Koleske, do you think it could potentially be a red flag for an applicant if their recommendation letter comes from a postdoc in the lab as opposed to the PI of the lab?
I mean, I think when I applied to grad school, I think I asked my PI for a letter, you know, the PI for the letter, but I also knew it was, you know, it was a big lab. It wasn't, I didn't have tons of one-on-one time with the PI. I was worried about, oh, what if the letter's just kind of, you know, blah, not that exciting. And so what I did was I asked the senior graduate student that I was working with in the lab to write me a letter. And I honestly think, I don't think it's a red flag at all, because when I'm reading these letters, I want to get a sense of what that person is actually like on the day-to-day in the lab. And the person who's going to know that the most and have the most detailed stories and examples of that are the people who are directly working and training and mentoring them. You know, I have to say, you know, probably it would, you know, if you can, if, you know, as long as you know that the letter, you know, you don't have like a horrible relationship for whatever reason with your advisor, like it doesn't hurt to have both letters. And because I think a lot of the times I give the benefit of the doubt if I see two letters like that, you know, I also know that a lot of PIs are really busy, and, you know, not everyone can be like a super fantastic mentor that's willing to get to know and write a great letter. So I don't hold it against a student if one letter is just kind of general and the other one is really stellar and speaks about the characteristics of the applicant.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep on this recommendation letter trend, but I want to reframe it from the perspective of talking about things that can potentially sink an application. And so one question that I'd like to answer live, is it a red flag if my letters of recommendation come from a community college professor who knows me well?
I think that'd be great.
Agreed. Agreed. And there's another question also on this topic. And it's, should I pick a previous PI that is going to write a weaker letter, or my current mentor who is not a PI, but a senior scientist that is respected in the field, that would be able to write a stronger letter? So again, speaking to the importance of who the letter is coming from, is that potentially considered a red flag in an application?
Yeah, I guess it's a question of how well. I don't pay that much attention to whose name comes in. I pay more attention to what the letter says than who it's coming from. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So in general, can you guys think about any kisses of death, so any other potential red flags that can sink an application? Or if an applicant is almost perfect, is there something that they usually tend to be missing? in their application?
I mean, I guess for us, sometimes it ends up being like, we really do care a lot about holistic applicants and well-rounded applicants. So, you know, if you're someone who is just never done, you know, like your grades are great and you know you're at a fancy school and you're doing all this research, but then you exhibit like no evidence of, you know, wanting to be involved in any type of outreach or leadership or community, like that actually ends up being for us a, you know, a kiss of death or a red flag, where it's just kind of like, to be able to succeed in grad school, you really, it's beyond just, it's not just test taking at some point, right? Like you really need to learn how to become engaged and embedded in some scientific community, learn how to communicate with people, learn how to train and mentor people. And so if you're not showing any evidence of wanting to do that and building up to there, I think that can sometimes be kind of a surprise, I think, that and something that, you know, we mark against, I guess. Yeah. So just well-roundedness is important, I think.
One of the things I wanted to say is that I do think that if you have a low GPA, it's the personal statement and the letters that are going to help. You could have a low GPA, and let's say it's like 2.9, and you have really strong letters of support that show that you can really work in the lab. It just means that someone has to make the investment to have you, and let's say if you're a minority in an IMSD program, that you can supply tutoring, or if you're not, then you can also get tutoring in that context that the school could provide to help you with your courses so that you could pass the written and research part, or prior to research part, excuse me. So that's an option. The other option is really to do the things that we talked about earlier, where if you have a low GPA, have an honest conversation with yourself, you apply, even if you have strong letters, and sometimes they'll recommend you to do the postbac program or a master's program. Don't take that as a slight, take that as an opportunity to improve. And necessarily, you don't have to go to that institution long term. You could go to another place after you've completed those particular requirements so that you have a larger base to be able to apply. Someone that may have a low GPA could also do really well on the GRE. You don't have to report your GRE score, so you could study and see if you do well. If you do well, and it provides a lot of rigor in your application, then you could put that as something to demonstrate that even though you have a low GPA, you have been able to synthesize the material in a way that comes off as a strong applicant because you can take a test well. So, and that's usually indicative of the first semester in grad school. Usually that's the correlation for the GRE. So that's just something to think about. So there's options that are available in that regard. And I don't think there's a kiss of death application. I do think that letters can be weary, but it also could be from experience. I would suggest that you have more than 5 strong letters of recommendation, and be aware that if you have a conversation with your previous PI or mentor in advance, and they'll ask you, you know, do you really want me to write you a lukewarm letter? So if you don't, just be honest. If you need more time to have stronger letters, it means that you may not be ready, but that's okay. I encourage you to still stay on the journey and then become ready.
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and it takes a lot of courage. But you actually, it's in your best interest to try to have an honest conversation about what kind of letter the person would write. And that's a very hard thing to do. And I recognize that's a hard thing to do. But it can save you a lot of time, and it can also set kind of the ground for what you need to do strategically. You know, and you could ask, you could ask what would it take? And that you could turn that lukewarm letter into a really powerful advocacy letter in a, you know, if you address whatever suggestions we make.
Thank you. You guys have already been giving some really wonderful advice. But what advice do you give to students who do not get admission offers? I know earlier it was mentioned potentially applying for post-bac programs, but do you guys have any other advice on what to do if you don't get an admissions offer?
One thing you can do is be a tech in a lab. And what I would say there is it's an opportunity to almost practice being a graduate student, right? And I think you can get really, I wouldn't ever do this unless you're getting paid to do it. So you need to have an income, I think, so that you can support yourself. But we have, I can think of just this week multiple people sort of asking me if I knew. So I think there's a real interest in this, and I think people will. I think with technical support, especially right now, I think there's enough of there's a pretty big need, honestly, in laboratories for scientific expertise, and so you could get in there and contribute to a team. I think it allows you to build a portfolio of skills. It allows you to demonstrate to one or more letter writers your dedication and your what you can do, and give them. I talked about specifics. It'll give them examples of specific things to point to in your recommendation letter. I think the post-bac programs are great as well. They're not. I think the one thing that they might give you that depending on which program you're talking about, they might give you an opportunity as well to take courses, so that and they're often structured in a way where you can take one or two courses, and that's an opportunity as well to if you're concerned at all about your grade point average, that you could address that head on, because you have an opportunity to take kind of graduate level courses and show that you can succeed.
That's a great point. And sometimes these post-bac programs, like the prep program at UC Davis too, you'll take some classes, but you'll also work in a lab, and having that chance to work in a lab in a year or two, maybe get on a paper, present at a conference, go to ABRCAMS or SACNAS. I think that can help. So, kind of maybe look at your application and try and get a sense for what you think you might have been missing. Was it that you just had a poor GPA and a total lack of experience? Then, maybe doing something like a post-bac program would be a good opportunity for you to get some more coursework and research experience. If you think it wasn't really anything to do with, your understanding of the curriculum, but just sometimes it's hard to get into graduate school, and you want to kind of help distinguish yourself, then doing something like working as a technician in a lab could really help. And I know the UC systems, and also I was at Stanford previously, and they also have these programs where it's either like an LSRP or a junior specialist. And these are technician positions that are designed for students who want to go into either graduate school or medical school and have like a max 2 years in which they're looking for some kind of technician employment. And part of that employment is preparing you towards being more competitive for these applications by making sure that you're doing research, getting on papers, learning sort of more critical thinking skills and things like that. And so looking for labs, I think, that really want to hire these kind of 2-year position technicians could be a really great in-between time before you go and try to go on the market again. Yeah, graduate school admissions again.
So one thing that I would say is that there's also bridges to doctoral programs, not only post-bac programs. So there's those options that are through the NIH as well. So for example, there's the FIST to Vanderbilt Bridges to Doctoral program. And it's kind of like they're expecting you to kind of go through the program and then go to the PhD portion at that institution. So it's not discussed, but it's a higher probability that you may get it because you've kind of been previously vetted. It's the same situation with a technician or a post-bac program. I would probably estimate somewhere between 10 to 30%, depending on the school, and increases your chances. So, and having letters from that institution that you're willing to apply to. Other things that you can do that are a little bit outside of the norm is start thinking about jobs in industry, not to stay, but just to be able to acquire some money so that you can be able, it can be an entry-level job so that you have money to be saved, that can be saved up, for graduate school. So you could take those 2 years. Also think about setting up a LinkedIn page and networking while you're starting undergrad from day one so that you can be in industry maybe for 1 to 2 years, maybe 2 to 3 years, and then take a summer to do an internship there that is paid because it's always important to be paid. But then that way you have your foot in the door. And so there's another opportunity to do that until you get into graduate school. And then working in industry always shows that you're adulting, if you will. And so that's viewed as a stronger person because they're taking, job more seriously. So they'll take the PhD more seriously. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think this idea that you would get letters from within an institution that you might be targeting for graduate school, that 100%. If I get a letter, from a colleague that's just down the hall, and somebody's, it's a pretty intimate, any medical school is pretty intimate setting. You can pretty quickly, I could just walk to that person's office and say, is this person as good as you said they are in this letter? And the answer is yes. And then, it's a pretty easy decision to make, to admit. So I do think that can really make a difference. And the networking thing's spot on. I've met students in the posters at Abracams, and we have a great conversation, and they've turned me in 5 or 10 minutes at their poster, they've turned me into an advocate for their admissions. So it's really, really important to get out there.
Right. Thank you. This is going to be our last main question. Again, lots of great advice this entire session, but do you guys have any parting words or anything that might be helpful to tell our current perspective PhD applicants this cycle?
I would say celebrate every win. So don't just apply to schools that are in the top 50, apply to schools in the top 100 and 150. You need to have safe schools that are a little bit of a stretch, but you can get into, and some that are a stretch based upon just pure numbers, not that your heart or your potential. And then this way you can start to see where the opportunities lie. And if you get into a PhD program, let's say at a school that maybe not as well known as in the top 20, go. It's an experience. You get your PhD, and then you can always do a postdoc, and you can be able to rise through the ranks if you want to do faculty, or a short postdoc if you're wanting to jump into industry or acquire different industry skills. So if you want different opportunities like in government or policy. So don't limit yourself only to like what you would call the name brand schools, because every school is name brand because you're getting a PhD. And so that is the highest degree in the land, and it's all about marketing at that thing at the end of the day. The last thing is celebrate your small successes. Do not think that getting an award or, submitting your application is not a win. I mean, I might be like, I'll give you an example. This week I had to host a conference. Then I'm at home right now, hanging out with my friends I'm on the NIH panel. I'm talking to you all. And then after this, I'm shutting it down and I'm celebrating a review that I got it submitted. So every small win is important, and get into that mindset because that's so important. And if you can start doing that, you'll start to feel better about yourself and not so much pressure related to the expectations of what the graduate or the academic world has put upon all of us. So that's just my closing word of advice.
Someone had posted a question about whether or not they should reach out to faculty at a target institution. I think that is a perfectly good thing to do. I think there's an art form to it. I think you can do it. It's a way to express enthusiasm, but I wouldn't do it in a way that takes the faculty member that's forcing them to commit to a response or to meeting with you. So, I think it could be, hey, here's my CV and personal statement, and I'm really interested and excited about your work, and I hope I get a chance to interview there. On our application, we also ask whether or not you've had contact with any Yale faculty, and I would certainly, if you sent me that email, I would certainly respond, and then you should definitely put in there that I've had an interaction about that. But I just wouldn't do, if you catch anyone on the wrong day, when they're really busy with a really long email that, it might just not have the impact. So I would say keep it short, keep it positive and aspirational, and you can always attach your CV or your personal statement. And if people want to follow up more, and don't take it personally if people don't respond. Some people are people in the sciences range in their emotional quotient across several orders of magnitude. So just don't take that part personally. But I guarantee you will get some positive responses.
Yeah, that's great. I would also say don't be afraid to ask as many people as you feel comfortable to read through your statements. This is something where I don't know, at least for me, especially when I was getting ready to apply to grad school, I maybe felt bad about, asking people to spend their time giving me feedback, but the surprising, like, you'd be surprised at how so many people just want to help you out. And so don't be shy to ask for feedback. It's almost even better if they're not an expert in the type of research you do, like getting people from really diverse backgrounds to just read through your statement and see, like, hey, did I make my science sound interesting to someone who's a non-expert? Like, right? Because when you apply for graduate school, a lot of times it's going to be a really broad group, right? Like neuroscience graduate, that spans so much of different subfields. And so it's really kind of an exercise in scientific communication at a really high level. And I think that's something that's hard to do. So getting some feedback can be helpful. And then it's up to you to kind of, everyone will have different opinions, and you can choose what you like and what you don't like. But I think just practicing that as well, getting feedback on your ideas will even help you too in the interview stage as well, right? When you get to do that. I guess we didn't talk much about the interview here, but that's another thing where when you're ready to go on, have your 5-minute elevator pitch practice, 2 to 5 minute thing, and do it with people who are not experts, and practice that so you can just flow through that really nicely.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Kim. That's such a great point. One thing that I would like to ask you guys is for applicants who are reapplying after a rejection at the same institution, do you have any advice for how they should maybe address that, or what to do about that? Or also another question that's related is if someone is leaving a prior PhD program and they're now applying to a different program, do you have advice for how they should address that or navigate that?
Yeah, that's tough. Because you're only kind of hearing one side of the situation. So what I would say is now, if there is someone who can write a letter, who can explain why it's not a good fit in addition to the applicant, I think that can go a long way to mitigate it. I know of circumstances where, for personal reasons, the person didn't want to be geographically where they were. And, of course that makes sense, but I think if it's hard to suss out, what the real reason for leaving is without any extra secondary explanation. There I would say, honestly, the dean of your graduate program is probably the most useful person if they would feel comfortable addressing the situation.
Right. Thank you so much. Yeah. I was thinking about that because I remember my first cycle of applying. I had gotten rejected from a university, and then the next year that motivated me to do a post-bac program, and then I reapplied and then got in. So I was just thinking about, a way that, potential PhD applicants can frame like their rejection as in like, you might have been lacking maybe research experiences, and then you took that feedback, took the time to, grow as an applicant, and now you're reapplying, having, further experiences. So things like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you have to address that. I would just treat it as friend. I would even think in our own institution, we don't necessarily track year to year if we've had a previous application for that person. So I guess I would, I don't know that you need to bring it up. I'd be interested in what the others hear, but I have to say, but I don't know that I'd bring it up.
Some things are left in the past. That's the best way to say certain things. A good example is when I was applying to graduate school, I didn't have such a stellar experience at one of my post-bac. My post-bac was good. One of my summer programs was good, and my home institution summer program was good, but I had another summer institution that was not good. I left it completely out of the application. And then also the PI was under the understanding that he wasn't going to write a letter. Now that relationship has healed since I'm doing all well. So they can write it in and say that they did something. However, at that time, this is just an example to give you kind of frame of reference, is that you don't have to have everything in your application. And then you also, if you are good, in a good standing with the chair of a department, having them or the dean to be able to help with the situation would probably be the best, because then they can speak to it if you need to address it. That's only if you need to.
Thank you.
And I would say that, every year where we see these applicants, it's going to be like, there are always going to be like a huge pool of applicants where you're like, they're so great. I would love for them to be a graduate student in this program. And it's just at some point, right, it just becomes a little bit random on who you end up deciding to invite for the interview or not that year. And so I don't think I would even think twice if I saw an applicant again the second time around. And if I even happened to remember for some reason that, oh, I saw them last year, it would probably at the most being like, oh, they're such a great candidate. It's a shame that, we didn't have space last year. I'm so glad they reapplied this year and have some extra research experience and we're able to invite them out. I don't think it's a negative in any way. And I've heard lots of stories of really successful PhD students ending up just like you at the same institution after the first time not having gotten in and then getting in and really excelling. So I wouldn't worry about even bringing it up like the other said.
Right. Thank you guys so much for taking the time today and being on our panel. It's been really meaningful hearing your thoughts and advice. And before we go, is there anything else that you guys would like, any other bits of wisdom that you guys would like to impart on us, or anything else you'd like to say?
Could I know this isn't about interviewing yet, but I feel some compulsion here. So I would say try to prepare really well for the interviewing. So I would even press them a little bit for your schedule. And if you have the bandwidth to do this, try to, at a minimum, go onto the website of the people that you're, and read there what they're working on, what their background is. And even if possible, you could go in, read maybe one paper. If you look at their publications, read one paper, or at least read an abstract, try to kind of get a sense, a frame of reference. It turns out that almost every person I've ever met likes to talk about themselves, and there's an enrichment for those in the academic area. And so I think, being able to refer to that in your interview, I think can go a long way. I've seen, when we've interviewed candidates for assistant professor, I've seen people, I certainly don't do this, but I've seen colleagues say, I don't want that person because they didn't express any interest in me. It seems improbable, but it's reality. So it's a little bit extra work, but I think it can go, you can really make a connection if you express specific, and hey, I read this and I had a question, or I read this, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because that sounds like something that I'm really interested in. And if when you get to the interview step, you don't have internet on the plane, right? So you could print these out, and now you have something to do on the plane ride. So.
And one last point, one of the things that when you're preparing for the interview, per school, make a binder. Print out the individuals that you're going to actually meet, including individuals that are chairs of each department, not just your chair, and deans as well, and also the diversity dean, if that's still in existence, or some other type of deans, so that you can know the faces at the institution. So you can say, hi, Dr. So-and-so, it's great to see you. Also, another tip is that to print out the abstracts on the website of the most important current topics of all people in the department, even if you're not interviewing with them, because you may see on your schedule that some of them are going to be at the dinner. So having that information ahead of time and putting it in a binder is important. Bring copies of your personal statement, letters of recommendation, and then also transcripts if they're available, because people sometimes don't prepare for an interview. So they'll ask you those questions. You can highlight those sections in advance that you want to uplift, so that they already have some notes to be able to say that are positive. And then if you put everything in plastic sheets, that looks very impressive. So just tips around that.
I love that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kim, is there anything you would like to add before we go?
I think a lot of it has been said already. I really enjoyed. I mean, I've been trying to scroll through the questions and answer some as we went along, just because there are so many. So I would just say, it's great to, if we can't get to them all here, then maybe if you can find some people through the Scientifico Latino network, or other networks that exist, like at Abercams and SACNAS, just to get these questions out and answered. Like, the more knowledge you have, the more confident you'll feel going through this process. And a lot of times confidence can just help you a lot, and especially in the interviewing process. Keep asking questions.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you guys for taking the time. And thank you to our participants for attending. And that will conclude our webinar for today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.